in terms of wind energy in the state. And, you know, in the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, we don't have the regulatory authority to, you know, basically tell developers where they can site wind farms. But it's a huge issue, conservation issue. And so we talked about, you know, a potential role of not only the Idaho Bat Working Group, but the Idaho chapter of the Wildlife Society overall in taking a position in things like that, and at least raising the awareness for the problem, because a lot of people in the state don't even understand the implications of wind energy to wildlife. So I would like to see the society also step up and do something to have an impact on, more of an impact on conservation in Idaho.
All right, Jonathan, what about the national level?
I think in years past, 70s and into the 80s, some of the, at that point, the facts were just not being recognized in a lot of the debates. And so there was clearly an advocacy role to play to just get the information out there about what are the impacts that are potentially occurring to wildlife from various kinds of activities. I think the arguments and the debates have gotten more sophisticated in more recent years. There's more arguments on both sides of some of these things, oftentimes more confusion with misinformation presented as science and so forth out there. It makes it tougher to be in an advocacy stance, and the recognition that if we go out and advocate beyond making sure the best science is being used, we potentially undermine the status of the science that we're putting forward. So we've learned over the years and had to get more sophisticated in how we address this advocacy role that the society can play.
Okay. Scott, I saw you had your hand up. Renaker? Oh, you didn't?
No, because I couldn't hear.
You couldn't hear? Oh, that's what this means. All right. Any questions from the audience? All right, well, I'll try to, what?
There's a question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'd be really interested to hear what the panel has to say about the future of the Wildlife Society, specifically in Idaho, and even parent. We've seen what's happened in the last 50 years. What about the next 50 years?
Did everyone hear that? What about the next 50 years? Let's go ahead and start with you, Don, and work our way through the panel.
Okay. Well, I think that's an excellent question. I appreciate you asking that. Part of our purpose in having this session this morning was to look at our past that hopefully will help guide us into the future. And I was going to mention this at the business meeting, but I'll talk about it a little bit now, in that what we're going to do shortly after this meeting, hopefully by next week or so, we're going to put out a questionnaire to you, our members, asking you, now you've heard about the past, and there's quite a few of you here that are part of that past, but there's a lot of new faces in the chapter, upcoming biologists that are going to lead us into the future. And we need to know, we're going to send out this survey to members, we need to know what you, members, want from the chapter, what you want the chapter to be, what you want the chapter to bring to you, and how are you going to contribute to make things happen in the chapter, in wildlife conservation, as a chapter member in the future. So we're looking to you through this survey to help set the tone, set the step forward that is going to bring us into that future.
I think one thing that we could all be thinking about in terms of the future of our society is taking a more active role in terms of what we can do as a society. I mean, we have lots of issues in Idaho, and unfortunately, this is common not only with our chapter, but other organizations, working groups, in that we need more people stepping up and volunteering to take on a particular issue and really work on figuring it out and making something happen. So even with the officers in our society, it's often difficult to get enough people to even run for office. So I think if we're going to be really effective moving forward with, we're going to have more emerging issues that come up in the state, and we just need to decide, what we want to do as a society, and then team up and make it happen.
Well, as I look at the future in this state in relationship to its wildlife resources, if we do not hang on to the land and water bases that produce that wildlife, we're whipping a dead horse. I think right now, let me give you a classic example. I think this outfit should jump right in the center of this legislative body we've got in this state that wants to convert the public lands to the state and ultimately some of it to private use. And I'm talking about millions of acres of land that they want the state to take over, and there is no way in God's world they can do it and do it properly. They can't even cover the basis for fire control. There's a lot of taxpayers outside the realm of the state of Idaho that have also got an equity in this situation. All you got to do is look at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife publication that comes out every 5 years. I think the latest one is what, 210 or 211? I can't remember. My memory's getting a little shaky. To find out what's cooking in terms of the values of wildlife in this state, it's staggering that we would let those people threaten or jeopardize, and the only thing they understand is economics, is the economic value of wildlife in this state. It's staggering. If you look at it, it's all free basically to a hell of a lot of us. So I'm saying get involved on some of the major issues that are going to impact the very species that you're concerned with.
I would say that a viable future for the Wildlife Society at all levels really depends on having a diverse background, diverse group of members. And I'm not talking just guys and gals. I'm talking members who represent not only different agencies at all levels, the private sector, a wide range, because one of the things that was advantageous when I was the chapter president and working for a consulting firm was I didn't have someone looking over my shoulder that maybe you have to be careful about what I said about a particular issue. A lot of you guys and gals out there, that's a concern, and it's a real concern. So if we can have a very diverse membership where it may not be the president of the organization, it may be a treasurer who signs a particular letter or takes a lead on a subject, or some member, I think that's going to go a long ways toward allowing us to take those advocacy roles that are necessary to support the use of good science in making reasonable and educated decisions.
During my presentation in the 1990s, I was reflecting back on some of the recollections that were given to me and shared with me from other presidents during that decade. And I had the good fortune of getting to talk to Ernie Abel, who's now living in Tallahassee. He just turned 80 in January and is still very involved in wildlife issues there. And one of the slides I had was a quote from Ernie was saying, we have an uphill battle dealing with some of our elected officials not really supporting the wildlife resources, supporting things that the chapter finds important. But during a phone call that I had with Ernie, he said that he was recalling developing a friendship with a staffer for one of the elected officials here in Idaho. And even though the official wasn't necessarily supportive, that staffer had a real interest in wolves, one thing. I happen to have the Huskies at home, and somehow Ernie, as he would, he was just a great guy to talk with, and he developed a friendship. And so what I think part of our future needs to involve is developing alliances with other folks that may not specifically be calling themselves a wildlife group, but from them we can draw additional support and strength. And I think a lot of us sense that we have adversaries in some of these key positions in government, but maybe they have a way in, so to speak, and maybe they aren't necessarily as anti as we think they are. So I guess the point being is that to the ability that we can in the future, I think we need to seek out these alliances with other organizations and with the folks that are in positions of power to help us move our cause along.
One thing that Don and I have always talked about during the last few years is that I've always brought it up is that there's biologists in the state that I know of, some of them I know quite well, yet they cannot make it to the meetings for whatever reason. Their federal bosses don't allow it, or they don't have the funding. One thing that I would like to see in the future would be every biologist, this is a utopia, every biologist in the state, no matter if you're federal, state, or NGO, you are a member of the Idaho chapter. It boggles my mind how they can work without having other folks to talk to about their issues, or even just coming to the meetings and seeing, oh, that's an interesting technique, we could do that. I think there's so much more that could be learned from those folks that aren't able to come. And that's one thing that I would see in the future, is that if we could just grab all the biologists. Not so much that we want their dues, but we want them to be here to be educated, to collaborate with others, rub shoulders. You can gain so much more insight just talking to people in the hallway at times, if you just get them here.
Well, from the Parent Society perspective, right now we are going through a strategic planning process that you will be hearing more about in wildlife or other places. One of the things that we've already identified, to pick up on Dave's point, that we see the Wildlife Society as having every wildlife biologist out there being a member of the Wildlife Society. That's a vision or a goal that we're trying to set for the future. And what we mean by wildlife, I think we have to look at that in a broad picture of the field, including a new diversity of focus areas that currently exist, and others that come out in the future. Conservation, all those kinds of things all come under the umbrella of wildlife management. Another thing we're trying to do is make sure that the Wildlife Society becomes the go-to organization for the science of wildlife biology. We are viewed as the source of information. And the more we can do that, and the more effective we will be as a society into the future. So 50 years from now, I don't know what it will really look like, but those are directions I think would start us to get to a positive trajectory.
All right, thanks. Any other questions? Or another question? Yes, go ahead.
The Idaho Fish and Game Commission has a lot of influence on how wildlife is managed in Idaho. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. You know, a lot of the folks on the commission are not biologists by background. What do you think the relationship between the Wildlife Society and the commission should be, if any, as far as perhaps in an advisory role or
Okay, I'll try to repeat that. The Idaho Department of Fish and Game Commission are 7 members appointed by the governor, and they serve 2 4-year terms. They're not biologists. How should biologists relate to the commission? Both, I guess, within the Fish and Game Department, but also for people outside the department that are biologists.
Well, and I mean the Wildlife Society. As
Oh, the
an
Wildlife Society.
Yeah.
Okay. Any takers?
I'll start. Well, what I would suggest is that if there's a particular issue that the Wildlife Society is concerned about that involves the commission, then I think we need to be at the commission meeting and present our perspective on any given issue, because the commission hears from people who show up at the commission meetings. And oftentimes those are, you know, they're the voices that are always there and often get their way. So if things are going to change, we need to have more voices at the meetings and offer alternative points of view.
And does that happen? I guess I don't keep abreast of what the Wildlife Society as a state chapter is doing. Does that happen?
Do you mean, does the Wildlife Society show up at the commission meeting?
Right.
Not to my knowledge, have they?
Not for several years. I think we have had officers of the Wildlife Society show up at commission meetings, but it would have been maybe in the 90s, the last time I can recall.
Well, I would echo what Rita had to say, and I think that's one of the things that we're looking for as the board, is you've heard in the past decades where the chapter has played more a advocacy role or an advisory role in either direct communications with decision bodies, including the Idaho Fish and Game Commission, our political delegates, and also letter writing to such bodies and entities. There's been a lull in the chapter's involvement in that advocacy or advisory role in the last few years, and maybe it's been even the last 10 years. We want to know if that's a role that we should take up again. I personally think we should be. As you heard from Marty, that this is the body across the state that has the most knowledge or where to find that information, that can provide that information to help at least be considered in decisions that affect the future, the current and the future management of fish and wildlife in this state. Idaho is fortunate in the natural resources that we have, and you're all in the business because you love those natural resources. I would suggest that we should be playing that role through this body, but we need to know if that's a torch that you want us to pick up again.
I might add that and I'm an outsider talking here about fish and game, but I wouldn't be surprised if one or several of the commissioners don't even know what the Wildlife Society is, or don't know that it's anything different from the Wilderness Society, another group of left-brain wackos out there that are trying to steer us in some direction we don't want to go. So perhaps starting with just even trying to educate them a bit as to who we are and what our levels of expertise are and what we may have to offer might be a place to start.
I think the hardest part about wearing two hats at a commission meeting, because they look at you as you're employed by, let's say, the Fish and Game, and now you're advocating a position by the Wildlife Society. If those two are opposed because of certain reasons, that all of a sudden now your neck is on a chopping block. So I think that's the reluctance that has been in the past, or actually more recently, not so much in the past, but more recently, is that I'm not sure I'm willing to stick my neck out because of ramifications of who I work for. So I think that's kind of maybe some of the issues too. If you could be a representative of the Wildlife Society and not have any background show up, that would be fine. We should all have our own opinions, and we should be able to speak those at commission meetings. But when they find out that, oh, you're biologist with Fish and Game, or whatever the issue, whatever agency is that, now it gets a little scary. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
Question and a comment. I'll start with Jonathan. But the Parent Society, I think, is doing a good job of communicating and being more of an advocacy organization. You open their site, the first thing you notice is what's in the news and what's nationwide, worldwide, now regarding wildlife. So that's a trend that I see. But in the comments, question I have is, isn't it our very nature as professionals to kind of be vocation orientated rather than advocation? I think the new opportunity in the next 50 years is a group that we haven't started to utilize as much as we could, and that is the nonprofit sector, and maybe even the private sector. So, John, could somebody like Boise Cascade or Idaho Power and the people that work with them be more involved? And for what David just said was, should the person that shows up be at the commission meeting be somebody from ICL, the Nature Conservancy, or Trout Island?
Well, there are retired people too. They're taking
I think the question you're asking has a couple of sides to it. I mean, one is the question of what should the Wildlife Society role be in advocacy. And we struggle with that constantly, in that we want to be out there, we want to be relevant, we want to be getting the right information in front of folks for them to make the best informed decisions. And we all share values that put us potentially separate as a group from the mainstream American public or legislators or whoever we're trying to influence. So we always have to be cognizant of where we're advocating for use of the best information, the best support for wildlife biologists to do their work, to make sure they have the budgets they need to do their work, versus putting our values into that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't put our values into some of that, but we have to be very careful, because once you engage values in that, you start to potentially lower the value of your scientific input into a debate. So that's the dilemma we find ourselves in. But I think as individuals, we should wear whatever hat we want and step up and promote the values that we feel as individuals, and try to make sure that the wildlife resources that are near and dear to all of us are getting the proper attention, and that our voices are heard for that, and engage as many other partners and organizations as we can in getting that message out as well.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Yeah, go ahead.
There's a little different tact. Where I wanted to portray how an individual can make a real impact. Remember the name of the gal that fought for the wild horses? And she won? The point I'm making here is, and I see a pretty fair representation of female gender throughout this group, I know of nobody that has more tenacity when they get locked on to something than the female gender. And here's the leg up on that situation. You, being biologists, you're automatically going to know more than the commission does, even though they get pretty good exposure to their own biological community in the department. But that legislature is wallowing in a vast sea of ignorance on almost all the issues they deal with. If you know an issue through and through, and you go down there and you listen to the dialogue at the legislature, you think, my God. Well, I'm saying again, you ladies could really make a difference, either at the commission or at the legislature, either the House or the Senate, because you have, as I say, a leg up on the situation. You probably know the topic better than they do, but they need to hear from you. I don't know if I've ever seen a lady get up at the commission meetings, and I've been exposed to a fair jag of commission meetings down through the years, that really got up and said, now this is the way it is, guys. I've never heard that. And the same thing prevails with the legislature and the committees. You'd be surprised if you really got your act together, how you can impact. Now, I found that out when I did go back to Washington, D.C., and I articulated for the Frank Church and Chamberlain Expressway. And they really listened because they knew damn well that I knew what I was talking about, that I'd spent the better part of my life in that area. Over 20 years trampling up and down through the Frank Church, and I don't think anybody knew it any better than I did. But once you get that dialogue going with whoever you're dealing with, then you can really, as I say, put some hay in the barn.
All right, thanks. Another question or comment? Yes, go ahead.
I've been detecting a real surge in interest in the sort of human dimensions aspects of all these things. And everybody's here, I think, the panel has touched on it. So a suggestion, we don't really need more science and more scientists and more data. We need more people who understand how to understand the values of the average person in the United States, how to relate and to get them jazzed. I mean, I think every person in the United States would say they love wildlife, and yet we're not able to tap 400 billion people and get them on our side. And we fail, I think, to do that because we don't have enough expertise yet, and for some of us enough training in the human dimensions aspect of this thing. So a suggestion that we dedicate next year's meeting to human dimensions, and I'll help with it. A question for John. Peter Kariba, the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy, spoke last week here in Boise. And he said their top priority for hiring experts right now, it's all in human dimensions. They don't need any more biologists. They need people who understand people who can turn that into action. So I'm wondering, John, if you expect your strategic, or if your strategic planning and your survey and all that is going to be taking any special look at that, or you're just going to see if that comes through the door?
I think communications, I think maybe communications is what you're really getting at is when you're saying human dimensions. At least that's a key part of all of that. And I think we recognize the importance of communications and are looking at communications in a number of ways. First of all, how can we be better communicators among ourselves to make sure we share information as effectively as possible, particularly in this new age of social media and everything else. But the bigger question you raise is how do we get our information and our message out to the rest of the world and the public and decision makers, et cetera. And we're looking at ways of doing that. Last year's plenary session that Winnie Kessler organized at our annual conference was on how to better communicate science to the public. And there was a panel of speakers that really talked about how do you get that message out so the public is interested in it. This year's plenary is going to be on related to the science of communication and some of the challenges that we face in getting information out that's accepted and utilized in the proper way by the public or policy decision makers because of some of the things that currently happen with conflicting information that gets presented, misinformation, and even the fact that better understanding how people have set opinions on something may not be swayed to your information, even if the facts are right there in front of them, unless you really learn how to get the right delivery to them. So these kinds of things, I think, are very important and are being recognized by the Parents Society.
Can I say something?
Go ahead.
I'd just like to, back to your comment, Terry, and you are already aware of this, but for everybody else who isn't, the values is something that we are incorporating into our revised state wildlife action plan because we're recognizing that decisions are not made just on biological things. So in in assessing species of greatest conservation need for our revision, we are incorporating economic value, social value, cultural significance, and a variety of other criteria to help us, put a value on wildlife and raise, let that be known. So for example, with bats alone, it's been quantified that they're worth over $313 million to the state of Idaho's agricultural industry. We need to be getting that information out there, because when people understand value, things change.
Okay, it's about time to wind down, and we might have time for one more question. Yeah, up in the corner.
We're talking about communication, and I'm sure all of you have panel communicated with our political leaders. Would you describe some of your most effective or favorite methods of getting an idea across to some of our politicians?
Your favorite methods of swimming through the ocean of, what did you call it, Marty? Go ahead, Don. You've been in the ocean recently.
Yes, in the sage-grouse ocean, it's a vortex, as I like to say, that you can't get out of. Favorite ways of communicating with them, I think really it comes down to what our speakers just recently just talked about, and that is understanding where are they coming from, understanding the values that they place on Idaho's wildlife, landscapes, and potential uses. And that's not meaning to say that you agree with all their viewpoints on these resources, but we do need to understand and know how to relate to those uses and resources and desires for those resources, and what the implications are in their world. So that's just something that we need to have a better feel for how to work in that arena. So I think, John and Marty and Rita touched on that. And it's not something that we as biologists are trained in. It's not something that we learn either in our schooling at the universities, or at least I didn't back in the day when I was in college. It's something that we've learned as we go along. And I think Terry has really hit on a good idea as to how can we help put together a session or a training that can help all of us, all of you out there, working in that arena. Because understanding our public, and our public is changing, and their interest in the natural resources are changing. We need to understand that before we can figure out how to address what can be best, not only from a wildlife standpoint, just in a pure natural sense, but how it's going to play out in the arena of what our public wants for our wildlife resources.
I think just last year, Fish and Game had a major success, and that was the Wildlife Summit. And no one's really mentioned that, but I think that was a great attempt at getting broad opinions from across the country. So, yeah, take on that.
Well, I think you're right, Tim. I think everybody feels like the Wildlife Summit was very successful, and it's a matter of how we build upon that and build off of that into the future as far as Idaho Fish and Game. And we need to, I think we can do we can build on that and take that forward. We've had a few struggles recently in the wolf arena, but I think we will we'll move forward in that. But I'm glad you mentioned that, Tim, because that reminded me that this topic really plays into what our plenary session was last year, and that was strengthening the public trust in science. And think about that session. And I would suggest 1 year later, remember that we videotaped that session. Well, we had some technicalities that it's taken a year to actually get that videotape prepared, but it is now ready, and it's going to be on YouTube and linked to the chapter website, so that, you know, recall what that discussion was all about. And that was giving perspectives from all views of who was interested in the natural resources of Idaho and how we reach out to the public and build that trust in science. So one thing I think we need to do is go back and look at that session again.
Particularly watch and listen to Bert Stevens, the legislator that we had on the panel, who talked about gaining trust by having a rapport with folks. Listen to what he had to say. I learned a lot from his talk last year. It was very enlightening how you can gain trust by just being there and talking to someone